And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. And I'm really pleased to be here working with, as part of the LHBT, as part of their training offer. I'm Sarah Buckingham. At the moment, I'm the team leader for Sustainable Design and Heritage in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. So today I am, to some extent, speaking from the context of somebody in a London local authority. But I can see from the list of participants that I think we're, shall we say, a mixed bag. So from a variety of backgrounds, I know that some people are probably here from the private sector and also perhaps building trusts, or people who are interested in making changes to buildings themselves. So I am conscious of that. So what I'm trying to do is to present a mixture of things, talking about obviously things from the local authority viewpoint and the law, and regarding heritage buildings, but also hopefully some of the actual details of the things you might be wanting to do to a building yourself. So just to say a couple of things about Kensington and Chelsea, the borough. It's often thought of as being particularly affluent, and that's to some extent true, but not universally so. But I think what's interesting about it is that we do have an awful lot of listed buildings and conservation areas, so we've got a lot of heritage to work with. But what's interesting about it is that many of our residents are early adopters of new technology and have the resources to improve their houses. So what we do have is a really useful testing ground for some of the technologies. We tend to see things as they emerge, or possibly early on when they emerge, and it's a testing ground to look at some of these things, and hopefully some of the stuff I can share will be helpful in other places. We also have very strong support from our members, our elected councillors, who want us to set a really good pace for introducing retrofitting and being quite innovative when we're looking at listed buildings. So hopefully I've got some experience that we've built up as a team that I can share with you this afternoon. So here are the things we'll be looking at today. Why retrofit, what are the challenges, a bit about the planning and listed building consent processes, because obviously they may kick in with a heritage and an old building, and then to look specifically at some of the kinds of interventions that might be made and their conservation implications. Got some top tips and links to further resources. I think in the time we've got, I can only really skim the surface and give you some pointers and some things to think about. So, and even the resources will, I think, if you follow them up, lead to other resources. It's a big field and growing. So really, it's just to give you a taster of the kind of things that might be of importance or interest to you in this area. Important to know what we do mean by retrofitting. It's a relatively new term to me, I have to admit. It means literally, and this is from a dictionary, Merriam-Webster, to furnish something, a machine, a computer, an airplane, a car even, or a building, with new or modified parts or equipment not available or considered necessary at the time of manufacture. And what it's very specifically come to mean now for us in the world of conservation and planning and buildings is to adapt existing buildings in order to reduce energy demand, essentially, by upgrading their fabric or their fittings, and by supplying more efficient energy, particularly through the use of renewable energy sources, which, as we know, can present all sorts of interesting conundrums. Just a little bit of the context that you might find useful. I'll start at the bottom, actually. The building regulations are really important. They set the standards for the energy performance of new and existing buildings where they're undergoing some sufficiently significant works, retrofitting or refurbishing. And it covers domestic and non-domestic buildings. And this part of the regs refers to the conservation of fuel and power and things like renewable energy. What's important to note from those is that listed buildings in conservation areas, scheduled monuments, don't have to fully comply with the requirements set out there. There's an acknowledgement that an existing building may not, particularly a historic building, may not be possible to bring up to the exact, the same standards as a brand new building, which has been built, well insulated, double or triple glazing, etc. And that's a realism, and that helps us very much in looking at how working with historic buildings. We're not expected to meet those standards, because that would be problematic in terms of the kind of changes that would have to be made. It also actually applies a similar approach to what are called historic and traditional dwellings, and it acknowledges the characteristics of historic and traditional dwellings, that they are generally permeable in their construction. So if moisture comes into them, it's able to evaporate outwards again gently. So you have to be mindful of that, and it's very much thinking about things like really traditional buildings, timber framing, wattle and daub, cob, things like that. Not something we're going to talk about much today, because we haven't got many in London. And they also say that new extensions to historic buildings should actually fully comply with energy efficiency standards, which is fair enough, because if it's a new fabric, then why not? Other bits of context for those of you in London are the GLA energy hierarchy. It's aimed at new buildings, but it can help us to think, it's a good conceptual framework for retrofitting as well. It's an inverted pyramid. And I suppose in the time available, it's just, to say that at the top, it's talking about basically the most important thing: use less energy. When you get down to the bottom, carbon offsetting, yes, it's a good thing, but you should only do that if you absolutely have to. And really, it's not the answer. Really, we should be using less energy and finding better ways to deliver that energy. And then on the right, we have the whole life carbon approach. There's quite a lot to think about there, but I think for today, it's just helpful to think of it as a way of, again, another conceptual framework for looking at retrofitting. And just remember that it's the use of carbon over the whole lifetime of a building that's important. And that reminds us, first of all, that existing buildings, if you retain them and reuse them, you're saving the embodied carbon they already have. And that's actually more efficient to start off with than their replacement. Of course, you can then have a discussion about whether producing a new building in their stead, which is an argument I have a lot at the moment, which is very carbon efficient, is actually a benefit or not. But you have to start with the existing building being something, its retention as being better in whole lifestyle terms. And also it helps to think that, well, sometimes you have to make an investment which involves use of carbon in order to save carbon in the long run. So it's the way of taking perspective on board in decision making. So why retrofit now? Well, I hardly need remind you of some of the things we've been seeing over, even just the past few months. The climate, of course, the climate change that underpins all of this, which has actually taken a bit of a backseat recently in the face of the changes to energy prices and the crisis we have really in terms of soaring energy prices. Of course, what it means is that it's in most people's interest, whether it's thinking long term or thinking just in the immediate term, it's in everybody's interest to think about how we can use less carbon, and retrofitting is really coming to the fore. Of course, and there's another problem there, that of course there are financial constraints for many people at the moment. So can people afford to do retrofitting? And again, take up may be reduced by the fact that there's less money for people to invest in this kind of thing. There are a range of energy grants available from government, including funding distributed through local authorities and aimed at small homeowners and small businesses, which may have a role to play, and that's probably something that needs a bit more investigation. I think the government's been less enthusiastic, as we've seen in the past few weeks, about the use of renewable energy on a large scale. So we'll see where that ends up. It's just worth noting that in the face of these incentives, shall we say, to retrofit, that a very high proportion of buildings in the UK are of traditional construction. So, you know, it is a major issue and widespread throughout the country. So some of the challenges for us, people have come together to talk about this today, is that it's all relatively new, and it's relatively, it's an area of thought and practice that's developing quite fast as well, particularly in the world of conservation. I think it really causes us, to my mind, to think very hard about how we normally do things, and whether we need to perhaps adjust our expectations a little. I think for many of us, and I'm sure that's why some of you are here, it's a time of finding out quite quickly new information, putting it to use, and developing confidence in working with new things and with what can often be very technical information. I've certainly had to educate myself, and my team have gone out and taken courses on this, because we've had to keep up, because we're having to do this on the ground. So again, I think it's helpful to share some of that experience. Also, I think there are areas probably will be needing more help and advice, say, from Historic England, and I might highlight, if I have a chance, at least one of those. Another challenge, it's developing understanding more widely, by which I mean perhaps as a local authority, with our residents or business owners, and how we communicate both the need for the change and appropriate responses to historic buildings. It's interesting that actually many of our building owners who own listed buildings are not aware that they actually can do retrofitting works, or they don't understand the extent of what's possible. They've actually told us that we won't allow them to do certain things without possibly checking that that's actually true. Although on the other hand, as a local authority, we do need to help people to come up with approaches that are actually going to work in the context of a historic building. On the right, there was an interesting article that was flashed by me a few weeks ago. It was sort of characterised as the entrepreneur, high-tech entrepreneur, not being allowed by the local authority to make retrofitting improvements to his, it was described as a grade 1 listed Elizabethan mansion. And of course, looking at that picture, you might think that's absolutely the case, but I've discovered on further research it is actually a 19th century house that looks like an Elizabethan mansion. And of course, I suppose the lesson there is, well, if it was an Elizabethan mansion, well, you know, perhaps there is less that you can do to that. But if it's a 19th century building, there could be areas of flexibility. And it's helping to people to understand those different, the different constraints that might apply depending on the building itself. Yeah, and I suppose it's helping people also, if they're planning retrofitting, to get over the sort of the daunting technical nature of it, and start, you know, finding ways through the maze and finding the best people to work with, and having some ideas about the breadth of what's possible. As a local authority, and I'll just dwell on this just briefly, we in terms of developing better understanding locally, we've done a few things. One is in our new local plan that's coming out, we have a chapter now on sustainability, but also a very specific policy relating to retrofitting, and saying, yes, we are open to the possibilities of retrofitting, providing it, it accords with our legal duty to preserve the special interest of our historic buildings and the character and appearance of our conservation areas. It's to bring it up and bring it to the front and say, yeah, don't assume that you can't do these things, but we need to talk about the details. And the details, we've set a lot more information out in our supplementary planning document, the SPD, the Greening SPD it's called, which has a whole chapter on retrofitting, information from which was abstracted to make a householder's guide. And we've got, on the right hand side, you can see our sort of traffic lights table, but we're trying to help people understand what's a good way to go, and what's about possibly literally a red area that they might want to avoid. Another challenge, well, it is that philosophical, practical challenge of keeping the balance. How do you, yes, say you want to insulate your roof. Well, there are ways of doing that have actually zero effect on the special interest of a building. Carefully laying what's it called, insulation down between the rafters. This isn't fixed in any way. That's actually not any harm at all. Whereas spraying the underside of the rafters with expanding foam, I think most people would consider is problematic in heritage terms. So you can make improvements, but you have to think about how you do them. And changes in building techniques since a lot of these buildings were created means that some of the measures, the standard measures such as expanding foam, which seems to be being recommended a lot, I'm seeing in looking on the internet, just aren't appropriate for historic properties. But that's not to say things can't be done. We aren't required to and can't necessarily achieve the same levels of energy efficiency as a new building, but we can really make substantive improvements through packages of works which might individually be low intervention, seem quite low key, but together can make a real difference. And I'll look at some of those shortly. Just to say, there's one proactive response that we've made as a council, which is to create a local listed building consent order. So through that, we have effectively granted listed building consent for most of the buildings in our borough to have solar panels on the roof. All people need to do is to check in with us about the details, and then they can go ahead. This is, I think, to be proactive in giving clarity on the parameters, what will be accepted, what won't. And also to get people perhaps over this preconception that they just can't do anything to their listed buildings. And I'll talk a bit about that later. Finally, before you start retrofitting, there's just a few precautions that, if you are going to draw up a retrofit plan, just a few things to be mindful of. Just think, understand your building first and foremost. What's it made of? What kind, its locations, what kind of, climatic constraints is it, or challenges is it meeting? Does it have one wall that's subjected to prevailing winds or rain? Yes. Does the orientation mean that it gets flooded with sunlight and starts heating up rapidly inside? Make sure you understand the significance of the building, of course. Maybe if it's listed, understand why, what's special about it, where might be the areas where there's flexibility. Maintenance, make sure that's up to date. Energy saving measures are much more effective if the building is fully repaired. So if it's weather tight, if there's no areas of damp, that's just that is the basic thing. I think all the advice says that it's going to be much more effective in energy terms if it's up to date. If you've got drafts and cracks indoors and things like that, then it's going to be less efficient. And finally, remember, traditional buildings breathe, as I mentioned before, that there has to be the ability for moisture to evaporate away. So sealing them up, and I'll talk a bit more about that when we look at some of the detailed things, can be really harmful because you'll get moisture accumulating in corners and bringing on mold and possibly worse in terms of the buildings, the fabric. So we start with one of the first two legs of retrofitting, reducing demand. So we'll go on to look at that. So possible types of insulation. Well, mainly these are really the walls or the roof. And the opportunities for insulation will depend on the building's construction and characteristics. Many buildings have a solid wall rather than cavity wall construction. And so you can't obviously upgrade the cavity because there isn't one. So it's a question of, do you add insulation on the inside or the outside? Lining walls internally has the potential to, it has the, so Lining walls internally using dry lining consists of layers of insulation with plasterboard over the top. That's quite a fat layer. So if you use that, it has the potential to change the internal characteristics of the building. It could cover features. If to be effective, it would cover features like cornices, skirtings, railings, dado rails, whatever, and it would change the dimensions of the room. And, you know, not everybody, I think, would necessarily be happy with that. In a listed building, that could easily be problematic. Having said that, I mean, we have a number of larger buildings which have been converted, say churches, you know, 19th century churches where there aren't actually many internal features, and there are parts of those which have that kind of internal insulation. And you can see it might work in a converted industrial building, perhaps, if the brickwork wasn't a feature. Obviously, you have to be careful when you're lining a building, not to, again, to prevent it from breathing. And what we're seeing recently is the arrival of more thermally efficient lime plaster, which is looking very promising as a way of at least making some improvements, but allowing breathability, something that, yeah, seems to be emerging now. Externally, again, it's all about these fat layers with block work and render. And as you can see from this photo, it has the potential really to make quite a change to the appearance of the building. You've lost any sense of features like the window, the lintels over the window, the decorative window lintels, which is a shame. And of course, it's also sticking out from other buildings next to it, which it doesn't particularly work well in a terrace unless everybody did it. And again, you would lose features. What's also interesting there is I can see immediately is that it doesn't reach the ground and it doesn't go right up to the eaves. So in fact, it's probably not particularly efficient anyway, because heat can still escape over and under it. There does seem to be thermal render on the market at the moment, but this still seems to be quite thick and need blockwork behind it, so it's not necessarily a suitable alternative. Roof insulation, however, and we saw those slides a couple of minutes ago, is worth considering, because you can do it with very little intervention at all into the building fabric, simply by laying insulating materials between the rafters. Roofs can also be insulated on the underside, not in the form of spray or foam, I think, because that seems awfully irreversible, but through the application of layers which sit, I think, above the rafters and below the roof covering. That can work, and we've seen examples working in historic, I think, listed buildings. Again, as long as there's ventilation. It does, of course, involve a change in the sort of the roof profile, so it could be a very small increase in the ridge height. So that would have to be considered, at least in conservation terms, even though it might be considered acceptable. Historic England has produced a lot of guidance documents on roof insulation, which I heartily recommend. Yeah, just a word on thermal bridging, which I think we saw, again, just to remind you, we've got the gap above and the gap below that external insulation. There's something to be avoided because they're sort of negating the actual work you're doing in insulating. So these are sort of little bridges to the outside world where there's but there's a direct connection between the inside and the outside through a building element which is more thermally conductive than the rest of the building envelope and isn't in any way insulated. So you're still losing heat outwards. And it creates condensation on the cooler surfaces, so it's all round a bad thing. And there's just a sort of an example here, and on the right it's probably not so easy to see, and this is a picture of a modern window, but window frames are quite well, unhelpfully they are thermal bridges. So if you can see on the right hand side, the green version, it's got a little strip of insulation just to stop the window frame becoming a thermal bridge. It can also be caused by badly installed insulation, as we saw with the building in the previous slide. Yeah, heat's escaping above and below. Upgrading windows, this is one of the biggie really in terms of what we get asked about and what we have, yes, disagreements with the public about. It can be seen as a very quick win in improving thermal efficiency, and of course it can be, that's true. But on the other hand, traditional windows and lead glazing, sometimes the glass itself, do make an important contribution to the significance of historic buildings. They were an integral part of the design when it's built, and if they survive from that period, they're really interesting historic fabric which are part of the story of the building. And they were made with great skill, often using materials of a higher quality than is typically available today. Think of the whole life carbon costs. So you wouldn't necessarily relinquish those without good reason, you know, if they were beyond repair, perhaps. And of course, they're very easy to replace. They're just a single element that can be whisked out and replaced with something new. But those changes can have significant impacts, not just on the building itself, but particularly in groups of buildings. And normally we would expect that you would keep historic windows and glass where at all possible, but that's not the end of the story. Just as they traditional windows, the good thing about them is that they can easily be and simply be repaired, unlike, say, a double glazed unit in whatever material. Timber can be spliced in, elements can be replaced, so you keep the essence of the thing even if small amounts of fabric have to be replaced. Yes, because of the high quality of the historic timber. Also, metal windows can often be repaired. And again, Historic England has got some quite detailed advice on that, which is again very helpful. However, if the windows are a replacement or they're sitting in a modern extension, why should it not be acceptable to replace them with perhaps slimline double glazing, you know, that respects the appearance of the building or the area? And I think to a greater extent, we are tending to allow that. Why not? And in this example here, at Pelham Crescent down in South Kensington, it's an interesting illustration because you have these very uniform terraces, but in many of them, I think they've had these not particularly good quality mansard extensions done, probably in the early 20th century. They've got an array of not very interesting windows. Sometimes these mansards are replaced. So why not allow double glazing in those? You know, what effect is it having on the really interesting part of the building below? In many of them, the French doors at first level seem to have been replaced at some point. I don't know, they seem to be particularly vulnerable to weathering. Again, why need they not be replaced with appropriately designed double glazing? You've lost the original, so why not? And we're looking more and more at allowing that. There are still some reservations about double glazing, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about it. Often people say, oh, you get this double reflection, which tells you it's double glazing, so it doesn't look characteristic. I've striven to see that double reflection. I haven't found it yet, but I'd be really interested in what anybody else thinks. There is a difference between modern, perfectly flat glass, certainly, and historic glass, should it survive, and quite often, you know, it has already been replaced. Yeah, there's a clear thing there. So moving on from listed buildings, the retention and repair of historic windows in unlisted buildings in conservation areas, we would strongly encourage, for the same reasons, the whole life carbon cost for the appearance and the character. But it's certainly so that they may be replaced with single glazed or slim profile double glazing in where it's well designed to respond to the characteristics of the building and the conservation area. Generally in houses, you don't need planning permission for this, and if you're doing it in, say, blocks of flats, it shouldn't need planning permission if the appearance of the building hasn't changed. So there's not that much control over it outside the world of listed buildings. But there are other strategies that can be resorted to in improving the thermal efficiency of buildings. Secondary glazing, I would say, is really promising and something to be looked at. It has very limited, involves limited intervention into the original building, window, sorry. It's an independent window system which sits inside the original windows, normally within the reveal. doesn't require any alterations to the existing windows, and is normally fitted through a sort of limited number of fixings into the window reveal. There's a lot of advice from Historic England. Again, secondary glazing for windows is very helpful, and we just borrowed that little diagram here, sectional diagram, to show how it just sits there inside the window, separate from the primary windows. We receive regular applications for installation of secondary glazing in listed buildings, and it's normally granted consent. It's not a problem, and it's always helpful to direct people to that if they're thinking of improving the installation of windows. It's also worth mentioning that actually, yeah, I've got to say, Historic England's research has shown that it can achieve pretty respectable levels of thermal efficiency, and it's good at noise attenuation as well. So for all the reasons you might be looking for double glazing, it can nearly match it, and in some circumstances is better. So it is a very worthwhile thing. Other window upgrades: draft proofing, not whether secondary glazing, because then you're setting up a badly ventilated space that might lead to moisture, but certainly if there's no secondary glazing, draft proofing either through these applied strips you can see on the left or chased in ones can make a huge difference. Use of thick curtains or thermal blinds are really effective, and we tried to persuade our local residents to use curtains, but they seem to have an aversion to it for whatever reason. There we go. Reinstatement of traditional shutters, they can be very effective at reducing heat loss as well. If they're well fitted, so they might need repairing or just generally refurbishing to make them work, they can be really effective. In some buildings you can see that there were shutters, so it's always going to be, there's a good chance that a reinstatement of shutters will be acceptable, subject to obviously the appropriate design. And sometimes it may even be possible to install new shutters if this design can be achieved, which works for the building, even if you can't see the traces of original ones. So I think Historic England research says heavy curtains reduced heat loss in sash windows by 39%, and well-fitted shutters reduced heat loss by 64%. So those are pretty good. Yeah, so pretty good achievements. We're also seeing more and more now the reglazing of historic windows with more thermally efficient glass, such as Histoglass, which is one named here. And there's an example I've got there of Finio glass, which is new to me, but had a handy diagram in the brochure. Yeah, all laminated glass is used, and it could be a solution for some windows. You can see the sort of it can be used as just double panes without a void between, which is helpful. Sorry, on here on the right, because then there's no a parting strip, this little gap that seals off the gap between the different panes and shows, kind of reveals that there's double glazing there, and can be problematic if it's too visible. So you can get these kinds of glass may have a use, and we're investigating whether you could use them perhaps in some of the more robust, perhaps late 19th century windows where there are a few glazing bars and really hefty frames, and where the glass that was used by that stage was already plate glass, so you're not losing any of the sort of characterful appearance you might get of, say, early 19th or 18th century piece of glass. These kinds of glass need rebates of 8 to 9 millimeters rather than 4 to 5, where the glazing is single, and some of these windows could accommodate that. It's not going to be suitable for all windows, however, but may prove more efficient in whole life carbon terms than slimline double glazing. And just mentioning, going back to double glazing for a second, I think we get the impression that some of these, or I'm reading that some of these slimline glazing systems are actually less durable than we would hope. They need replacing in 15 to 20 years. So going back to whole life carbon costs, is that in the end going to be the right kind of change? That throws a bit of doubt on that. Right, damp proofing. Yeah, as I said, a damp building is not going to be an energy efficient building, and that's there in British Standard and most advice on this. We often get requests for damp proofing measures, and what's important to remember is that, basically tanking a building with impermeable concrete is generally going to make things worse. It's going to force the damp to go out elsewhere. I've seen examples where that means it goes into next door's basement, which is hardly fair. So you can also push it up the wall so it comes up higher up in the building. What we do look at a lot is cavity membrane systems, and on the left, and that's just an example of one. And the essence of those is that the dry lining sort of membrane is put in, and oh no, there's two membranes there. Yeah, there's a membrane, and the as damp comes out of any wall, it condenses and trickles down behind the membrane into the drain at the bottom, and then it's sort of it flows away in the normal way. So it's not certainly not doing something irreversible to the walls and coating them in concrete, basically. So that's the thing that can be done. It has the advantage, these systems, of having the flexibility to work around non-orthogonal spaces, shall we say, so things with bends and curves. So you need to be sure that the system can accommodate those, because, for instance, we have a lot of coal vaults which are waterproofed in that way. And on the right there's an example from, where is it? It's somewhere, I can't remember. It's the National Trust property, the name of which has now dropped off my presentation. Sorry about that, but it was done by with damp proofed with a cavity membrane system. And you can see there's quite a lot of detail in there that they've worked around, and then it's plastered over on the inside. But before you actually think of damp proofing measures, just to backtrack a bit, you just have to check all the basics of the building. And again, it's going back to know your building. Is there a leaking pipe? Is there an overflowing gutter? If you sort that out, sometimes the damp problems go away. Maybe a bit of repointing. And yeah, don't necessarily want people to leap to the damp proofing solution first. And it's also saying, the first thing to do if you think you need damp proofing is to get a survey by an independent damp specialist. Don't get a survey from somebody who's selling a damp proof system, because I think what they're going to find you need at the end of it. And that's what we would always ask people to go to first. Upgrading services now. This is now, yes, in terms of replacing existing building services with energy efficient upgrades is always worth considering, particularly where the energy services are close to the end of their economic life. If your gas boiler is nearly done for, you might consider replacing it with something that's more energy efficient. In fact, you would and almost certainly should. Clearly, if replacing equipment for the sake of it is not particularly not particularly desirable, so it should be where there's a need. Gas boilers are a particular issue, and I think at the moment, clearly, the ideal is that they're phased out in order to reach net zero in emissions term. And ideally, they'd be replaced with heat pumps or a connection to a low carbon network. But this isn't going to be feasible for everybody, not least for cost considerations. So maybe a more efficient gas boiler in the interim is the answer. And then, of course, these things are addressed in the building regs. Air conditioning, it's just worth a mention of. I mean, it uses energy, and therefore it's less efficient than, I don't know, opening a window or drawing a blind. And these are things that can be used to keep internal temperatures of houses down, particularly closing blinds or curtains, in the few, growing but still relatively few, very, very hot spells we have in this country. However, we have a lot of air conditioning already in place, and we have to work with that. So ideally, we'll be directing people towards more efficient units. Other improvements to services which are obvious, but just remember and don't have any effect at all on historic interest really, are just changing light fittings, changing, if anybody's got any incandescent bulbs left, changing them for low energy light fittings, using the lighting controls carefully, as we all know, turning the boiler down a notch, using a heat controller. So yeah, a whole group of simple changes can achieve energy savings and add into the mix. And if you take them alongside other simple changes, it can add up to making a difference that's worthwhile. Quick word about mechanical ventilation. Obviously, the sort of passive house constructions that are very interesting and do achieve a lot of energy savings. They rely on very high levels of insulation and sealing the building in from the exterior, and therefore requiring mechanical ventilation. Not necessarily going to be successful in historic buildings because of the need for the building to breathe, and because the characteristics of the building, you're introducing more equipment which in some interiors simply isn't going to be appropriate. There is an example of a Georgian house in Bloomsbury, which I did track down, where they've attempted to use a sort of passive house system, and I think what they've done is had to sort of use different strategies for different parts of the house depending on the historic interest. So it might be a partial solution, and I've included a link to that in the further resources section, so hopefully that'll be helpful. So some thoughts on renewable energy quickly. Obviously, three main forms: wind, water, photovoltaic, but also other forms of solar equipment, and air or ground source heat pumps. In terms of wind, I'm not thinking about the big groups of turbines, the ones that are very controversial, but the small domestic turbines. I think they can be quite challenging, clearly. You have to have the land to install them for a start, and that's not always going to be available in an urban setting, possibly in rural suburban locations, but they have to then take account of the setting of particularly of a historic building or the character and appearance of a conservation area. They tend to give rise to objections from neighbours, which may or may not be an inhibitor. They require investment, of course, and the wind doesn't blow all the time, as people are fond of telling us. They're more likely to be a supplement to than a replacement for conventional power sources on an individual household level. So I've got two wind there. Solar equipment. I think there's two main kinds: there's photovoltaic and solar thermal, which is top left here, solar thermal equipment which heats water and then uses that. Does it use it to run radiators? It probably does. Can't remember, but it does heat water, and that's the source of the energy. In my view, it's probably the most likely to be adapted for use on existing buildings, including listed buildings and buildings in conservation areas. It's particularly worth exploring where there's potential for setting it discreetly on houses with, I don't know, roofs set behind parapets, flat roofs, or even on the rear of pitched roofs, for instance, in this borough, where some of the roofs are so tall that you can't, there's very little visual impact from the ground anyway. And we've got some interesting double ridge roofs, so there's a V in the middle where you can put quite a few solar panels, in fact. And obviously it should be taken into account that the roof is up to taking the extra weight, and again, in many of our 19th century buildings that's not such an issue. And also you can see, so solar equipment or solar panels can work, and what you see on the left here, we've got solar tiles or slates, which I think are really coming on now as technologically speaking. They're probably more efficient, but also looking much better than they have in the past. I think was put off them sort of by seeing examples many years ago, which are just basically crude and didn't work at all visually, but I think they're now much more subtle. So there's a lot of potential there. And you can see that it's quite a controversial issue, that, you know, people are both installing solar panels all over England and being asked to remove their solar panels. So it feels to me like that those of us in the world of conservation have to really think hard about simply rejecting them. I was given a copy of a report by the GLA earlier this week, which I haven't had time to read because it's 168 pages. But I think their research, the summary at the beginning says that their research with a small number of London boroughs said most of them considered that solar panels were harmful. And I just think that it all depends, and we really have to perhaps reevaluate the way we approach this, and you know, the balance public benefit test of making changes and try and be flexible. Admittedly, the example in the middle is a bit crass, and perhaps there's a better way of doing that. But, you know, I think we have to be more open to the possibility of solar equipment, because it's going to probably be incredibly useful for many people. And there are acres, square miles of roof space in London which could be put to use. Just to go back to our local listed building consent order, where we've really tackled this head on, covers most of our buildings, to be honest. We've only excluded grade 2 stars. Well, we've excluded grade 1s, but 2 stars where only where they're going to be visible over a large area. For instance, in the Chelsea Hospital, where you can see them over the registered park and garden. Now however, these buildings at the bottom in Royal Crescent are actually 2-star, but there's a lot of scope on those roofs for solar panels, and in fact, their special interest as a crescent wouldn't be harmed by it. So we allow both solar PV panels, solar thermal and solar slates. Those are explicitly asked for by local residents when we consulted them. And, you know, we've also been clear about what we mean by equipment that goes with them. So there shouldn't be any rogue large boxes appearing. These are just a couple of pictures of grade 2-star listed buildings in Brompton Cemetery, which I'd originally excluded from the order, but turns out they've already got PV panels. And who knew? Because I certainly didn't until I started looking at everything on Google Earth. Excuse me, sorry. Solar panels on domestic buildings don't need planning permission. So what our order has done is replicated the provisions of the General Permitted Development Order, so that when we grant listed building consent, it means that as long as you would follow the listed building consent order, you also don't need planning permission. So we've taken away most of the consent, most of the regulations that are required to get solar panels. Which means that they shouldn't be on a roof slope facing a highway, but there you go. There'll be other solutions for buildings where that's their south facing slope, and they should be removed when they're no longer needed. Technology, we hope, will move on, and there'll be other ways of doing this which are even more efficient. Oh, sorry. Oh. Condition 6 just asks people to give us details of the design, the colour, whether they're going to, you know, the finish, because we don't want reflective finishes, we want the more matte finish, and any other associated stuff, just as a light touch way to fine-tune their design. And also, so, you know, if anybody is concerned, there's a chance for them to let us know. And we're going to produce some design advice to support residents who are coming forward just for approval of that condition. I've just included the example of the CPRE design advice, because it's so good, really, it's very helpful. I do recommend you check that out if you're thinking about solar panels. It's very helpful. Air source heat pumps, basically it looks like an air conditioning condenser, but it isn't. I've seen some that look like a double fridge. They're big things, and there is a use for them, certainly in many historic buildings, subject to having somewhere sensible to locate them, and perhaps looking at something like an enclosure. And I think they also probably need it for acoustic reasons as well. I mean, that's not necessarily the best example, but there it is, that they can be covered up. They have a fan unit which brings in air from outside, moves over a heat exchange service. they're essentially heating up water, which is then used as for water and also to supply radiators. I think again the technology of these is improving, that so they're getting perhaps almost to the point where they can, to the point where they're helpful. They do tend to be used in new buildings alongside a lot of insulation. So again, you have to go back to thinking about the whole building and how these things can work together. Is it worth it if you need a degree of insulation that's actually not achievable? At the moment, the jury seems to be out on whether you need new radiators or not. I'm reading a lot of assurances that you don't, but I suspect again that their efficiency will be greatly increased if you have the right kind of radiators, which again could be an issue within a historic building. And the need for new, although many listed buildings have radiators already, and if it's simply swapping, that's probably not a problem. Ground source heat pumps, again, less of a potential in an urban area. As you can see from the diagram on the top right, you need a lot of space to bury your, whatever it's called, it's I can't remember, a collector loop. So sorry. And I would say that actually in heritage terms that archaeology may be an issue there, because clearly there's excavation required. So we come to the top tips, and I think this is really just a reiteration of what I said previously. Don't be downhearted. Sensitive retrofitting of historic or other traditionally constructed buildings should be able to secure some improvements. Even if you can't reach the same standards as a new building, you can save energy and improve comfort. And of course, a lot of this is just about having a more comfortable environment. Start off by understanding the whole building. What is the construction? How is it used? Have you got a steam laundry in the basement? Well, probably it's going to be quite a lot of steam down there, condensation. And think about those characteristics in your retrofit plan and look at the building as a whole organism, as it were. Of course, if you're not already aware, check whether it's listed or in a conservation area, or if there's any other restrictions. I think there might be an Article 4 direction which stops you from doing particular things to the building. And if it is a historic building, find out why it's considered important, what's its significance, and that will help you to think about the kind of changes you can make that are likely to be accepted. Always think about repairs and maintenance first. If the building's weathertight and doesn't have damp coming from gutters or whatever, it's going to be more energy efficient. Think about the whole life carbon cycle. It's not just about achieving short-term savings, or it's about the long term. There are things that you could be preserving, and embodied energy you could be saving. And if you need, through the need for planning permission or listed building consent, to demonstrate that in the retrofit plan, do think about that and get it included. Oh, actually, I suppose one thing I was going to say in terms of further training need, we are seeing lots of whole life carbon reports coming through now, and I think it would be very timely if Historic England could start giving us advice on how to look at those, or another training provider, because I think rather like viability reports, that I think you can get them to say more or less what you want if you use the right figures. So I think we need to keep up with the industry there on that front. If you're doing a larger scheme on a building, I think you will normally be expected to include sustainability measures now. So having the right kind of demonstration of that through a design and access statement or a retrofitting plan, or whatever is going to be important. And just think about any risks. So, if are any of the changes likely to reduce ventilation or cause any buildup of condensation, and just factor that into anything you decide to do with the building. There's a few links and resources, and I guess we can share them. The British Standard, which is helpful, but British standards, as we know, are expensive. Building regulations, those are online. Historic England has tons and tons of good advice, and if you start there on their energy efficiency and historic buildings page. It's got a whole series of documents linked to it, and you could, read for a long time and find out lots. I've listed a few of those things here. I've listed the Bloomsbury case study here, so that's useful. And some other documents of the sustainable, I had to write the name down because I couldn't remember what they're called, Sustainable Traditional Buildings Alliance, that's the one, has got a lot of interesting information online, including the Responsible Retrofit Guidance Wheel, which is fun. And then obviously other government bodies have produced a lot of things, and in London in particular, there's resources such as Heat Map and the Solar Opportunity Map, and then Green Building Council and GNI. So there's a lot there, and I'm sure we'll be able to share them with you. Oh yes, and finally, of course, let's not forget the Society for the Protection of Old Buildings, which has got some cracking publications on the subject, which you might want to avail yourself of. So that's me, and I hope I haven't